Chapter 13 of Famous Men of the Middle Ages. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Alec Datesman. Famous Men of the Middle Ages by John H. Haran and A. B. Poland. Chapter 13. Egbert, king from 802 to 837 A.D. 1. Egbert the Saxon lived at the same time as did Harun al-Rashid and Charlemagne. He was the first king who ruled all England as one kingdom. Long before his birth, the people who are known to us as Britons lived there, and they gave to the island the name Britain. But Britain was invaded by the Romans under Julius Caesar and his successors, and all that part of it which we now call England was added to the Empire of Rome. The Britons were driven into Wales and Cornwall, the western sections of the island. The Romans kept possession of the island for nearly 400 years. They did not leave it until 410, the year that Alaric sacked the city of Rome. At this time, the Roman legions were withdrawn from Britain. Some years before this, the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, German tribes, had settled near the shores of the North Sea. They learned much about Britain, for trading vessels, even at that early day, crossed the Channel. Among other things, the men from the north learned that Britain was crossed with good Roman roads, and dotted with houses of brick and stone, that walled cities had taken the place of tented camps, and that the country for miles round each city was green every spring with waving wheat, or white with orchard blossoms. After the Roman legions had left Britain, the Jutes, led, it is said, by two great captains named Hengist and Horsa, landed upon the southeastern coast and made a settlement. Britain proved a pleasant place to live in, and soon the Angles and Saxons also left the North Sea shores and invaded the beautiful island. The new invaders met with brave resistance. The Britons were headed by King Arthur, about whom many marvelous stories are told. His court was held at Caerleon, in North Wales, where his 150 knights banqueted at their famous Round Table. The British king and his knights fought with desperate heroism, but they could not drive back the Saxons and their companions, and were obliged to seek refuge in the western mountainous parts of the island, just as their forefathers had done when the Romans invaded Britain. Thus nearly all England came into the possession of the three invading tribes. 2. Arthur and his knights were devoted Christians, for the Romans had not only made good roads and built strong walls and forts in Britain, but they had also brought the Christian religion into the island. And at about the time of the Saxon invasion, St. Patrick was founding churches and monasteries in Ireland, and was baptizing whole clans of the Irish at a time. It is said that he baptized 12,000 persons with his own hand. Missionaries were sent out by the Irish Church to convert the wild Picts of Scotland, and at a later day the distant barbarians of Germany and Switzerland. The Saxons, Angles, and Jutes believed in the Old Norse gods, and Tiu and Woden, Thor and Frigga, or Frisia, were worshipped on the soil of Britain for more than 100 years. The Britons tried to convert their conquerors, but the invaders did not care to be taught religion by those whom they had conquered, so the British missionaries found the work unusually hard. Aid came to them in a singular way. At some time near the year 575 A.D., the Saxons quarreled and fought with their old friends, the Angles. They took some Angles prisoners and carried them to Rome to be sold in the great slave market there. A monk named Gregory passed one day through the market and saw 3 captives. He asked the dealer who they were. Angles was the answer. "Oh," said the monk, "they would be angels instead of Angles if they were only Christians, for they certainly have the faces of angels." Years after, when that monk was the Pope of Rome, he remembered this conversation and sent the monk Augustine to England to teach the Christian religion to the savage but angel-faced Angles. Augustine and the British missionaries converted the Anglo-Saxons 200 years before the German Saxons were converted. Still, though both Angles and Saxons called themselves Christians, they were seldom at peace, and for more than 200 years they frequently fought. Various chiefs tried to make themselves kings, and at length there came to be no less than 7 small kingdoms in South Britain. In 784, Egbert claimed to be the heir of the kingdom called Wessex, but the people elected another man, and Egbert had to flee for his life. He went to the court of Charlemagne, and was with the great king of the Franks in Rome on Christmas Day 800, when the Pope placed the crown on Charles's head and proclaimed him emperor. Soon after this, a welcome message came to Egbert. The mind of the people in Wessex had changed, and they had elected him king. So bidding farewell to Charlemagne, he hurried to England. Egbert had seen how Charlemagne had compelled the different quarreling tribes of Germany to yield allegiance to him, and how after uniting his empire, he had ruled it well. Egbert did in England what Charlemagne had done in Germany. He either persuaded the various petty kingdoms of the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes to recognize him as their ruler, or forced them to do so, and thus under him all England became one united kingdom. But Egbert did even better than this. He did much to harmonize the different tribes by his wise conciliation. The name England is a memorial of this, for though Egbert himself was a Saxon, he advised that to please the Angles the country should be called Anglia, that is, Angleland, or England, the land of the Angles, instead of Saxonia, or Saxon land. End of Chapter 13. Recorded by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York.
Chapter 14 of Famous Men of the Middle Ages. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox, LibriVox.org. Recording by Paradise Camouflage. Famous Men of the Middle Ages by John H. Harren and E.B. Poland. Chapter 14. Rollo the Viking. Died 931 AD. Part 1. For more than 200 years during the Middle Ages, the Christian countries of Europe were attacked on the southwest by the Saracens of Spain and on the northwest by the Norsemen, or Northmen. The Northmen were so called because they came into Middle Europe from the north. Sometimes they were called Vikings or pirates because they were adventurous sea robbers who plundered all countries which they could reach by sea. Their ships were long and swift. In the centre was placed a single mast which carried one large sail. For the most part, however, the Norsemen depended on rowing, not on the wind, and sometimes there were 20 rowers in one vessel. The Vikings were a terror to all their neighbours, but the two regions that suffered most from their attacks were the island of Britain and that part of Charlemagne's empire in which the Franks were settled. Nearly 50 times in 200 years the lands of the Franks were invaded. The Vikings sailed up the large rivers into the heart of the region, which we now call France, and captured and pillaged cities and towns. Some years after Charlemagne's death, they went as far as his capital, Aix, took the place, and stabled their horses in the cathedral which the great emperor had built. In the year 860 they discovered Iceland and made a settlement upon its shores. A few years later they sailed as far as Greenland, and there established settlements which existed for about a century. These Vikings were the first discoverers on the continent on which we live. Ancient books found in Iceland tell the story of their discovery. It is related that a Viking ship was driven during a storm to a strange coast, which is thought to have been that part of America now known as Labrador. When the captain of the ship returned home, he told what he had seen. His tale so excited the curiosity of a young Viking prince called Leif the Lucky that he sailed to the newly discovered coast. Going ashore, he found that the country abounded in wild grapes, and so he called it Vinland, or the land of vines. Vinland is thought to have been a part of what is now the Rhode Island coast. The Vikings were not aware that they had found a great unknown continent. No one in the more civilized parts of Europe knew anything about their discovery, and after a while the story of the Vinland voyages seems to have been forgotten, even among the Vikings themselves. So it is not to them that we owe the discovery of America, but to Columbus, because his discovery, though nearly 500 years later than that of the Norsemen, actually made known to all Europe, for all time, the existence of the New World. The Vikings had many able chieftains. One of the most famous was Rollo the Walker, so called because he was a giant that no horse strong enough to carry him could be found, and therefore he always had to walk. However, he did on foot what few could do on horseback. In 885, 700 ships, commanded by Rollo and other Viking chiefs, left the harbours of Norway, sailed to the mouth of the Seine, and started up the river to capture the city of Paris. Rollo and his men stopped on the way to Rouen, which also was on the Seine, but nearer its mouth. The citizens had heard of the giant, and when they saw the river covered by his fleet, they were dismayed. However, the Bishop of Rouen told them that Rollo could be as noble and generous as he was fierce, and he advised them to open their gates and trust to the mercy of the Viking chief. This was done, and Rollo marched into Rouen and took possession of it. The bishop had given good advice, for Rollo treated the people very kindly. Soon after capturing Rouen, he left the place, sailed up the river to Paris, and joined the other Viking chiefs. And now for 6 long miles the beautiful Seine was covered with Viking vessels, which carried an army of 30,000 men. A noted warrior named Eudes was Count of Paris, and he had advised the Parisians to fortify the city. So not long before the arrival of Rollo and his companions, 2 walls with strong gates had been built round Paris. It was no easy task for even Vikings to capture a strongly walled city. We are told that Rollo and his men built a high tower and rolled it on wheels up to the walls. At its top was a floor well manned with soldiers. The people within the city shot hundreds of arrows at the besiegers and threw down rocks or poured boiling oil and pitch upon them. The Vikings thought to starve the Parisians, and for 13 months they encamped round the city. At length food became very scarce, and Count Eudes determined to go for help. He went out through one of the gates on a dark, stormy night, and rode post-haste to the king. He told him that something must be done to save the people of Paris. So the king gathered an army and marched to the city. No battle was fought. The Vikings seemed to have been afraid to risk one. They gave up the siege, and Paris was relieved. Rollo and his men went to the duchy of Burgundy, where, as now, the finest crops were raised and the best of wines were made. Part 3. Perhaps after a time Rollo and his Vikings went home, but we do not know what he did for about 25 years. We do know that he abandoned his old home in Norway in 911. Then he and his people sailed from the icy shore of Norway and again went up the Seine in hundreds of Viking vessels. Of course, on arriving in the land of the Franks, Rollo at once began to plunder towns and farms. Charles, then king of the Franks, although his people called him the Simple or Senseless, had sense enough to see that this must be stopped. So he sent a message to Rollo and proposed that they should have a talk about peace. Rollo agreed, and accordingly they met. The king and his troops stood on one side of a little river, and Rollo with his Vikings stood on the other. Messages passed between them. The king asked Rollo what he wanted. "Let me and my people live in the land of the Franks. Let us make ourselves homes here, and I and my Vikings will become your vassals," answered Rollo. He asked for Rouen and the neighbouring land. So the king gave him that part of Francia, and ever since it has been called Normandy, the land of the Northmen. When it was decided that the Vikings should settle in Francia and become subjects of the Frankish king, Rollo was told that he must kiss the foot of Charles in token that he would be the king's vassal. The haughty Viking refused. "Never," said he, "will I bend my knee before any man, and no man's foot will I kiss." After some persuasion, however, he ordered one of his men to perform the act of homage for him. The king was on horseback, and the Norseman, standing by the side of the horse, suddenly seized the king's foot and drew it up to his lips. This almost made the king fall from his horse, to the great amusement of the Norsemen. Becoming a vassal to the king meant that if the king went to war, Rollo would be obliged to join his army and bring a certain number of armed men, 1,000 or more. Rollo now granted parts of Normandy to his leading men on condition that they would bring soldiers to his army and fight under him. They became his vassals, as he was the king's vassal. The lands granted to vassals in this way were called feuds, and this plan of holding lands was called a feudal system. It was established in every country of Europe during the Middle Ages. The poorest people were called serfs. They were almost slaves and were never permitted to leave the estate to which they belonged. They did all the work. They worked chiefly for the landlords, but partly for themselves. Having been a robber himself, Rollo knew what a shocking thing it was to ravage and plunder, and he determined to change his people's habits. He made strict laws and hanged robbers. His duchy thus became one of the safest parts of Europe. The Northmen learnt the language of the Franks and adopted their religion. The story of Rollo is especially interesting to us, because Rollo was the forefather of that famous Duke of Normandy, who, less than 150 years later, conquered England and brought into that country the Norman nobles with their French language and customs. End of chapter 14. Recording by Andy from Inverarnon, Scotland.
Chapter 15 of Famous Men of the Middle Ages. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Alec Datesman. Famous Men of the Middle Ages by John H. Harron and A. B. Poland. Chapter 15. Alfred the Great, king from 871 to 901 AD. 1. The Danes were neighbors of the Norwegian Vikings, and like them were fond of the sea and piracy. They plundered the English coasts for more than a century, and most of northern and eastern England became for a time a Danish country with Danish kings. What saved the rest of the country to the Saxons was the courage of the great Saxon king Alfred. Alfred was the son of Ethelwulf, king of the West Saxons. He had a loving mother who brought him up with great care. Up to the age of 12, it is said, he was not able to read well, in spite of the efforts of his mother and others to teach him. When Alfred was a boy, there were no printed books. The wonderful art of printing was not invented until about the year 1440, nearly 600 years later than Alfred's time. Moreover, the art of making paper had not yet been invented. Consequently, the few books in use in Alfred's time were written by skillful penmen, who wrote generally on leaves of parchment, which was sheepskin carefully prepared so that it might retain ink. One day, Alfred's mother showed him and his elder brothers a beautiful volume which contained a number of the best Saxon ballads. Some of the words in this book were written in brightly colored letters, and upon many of the leaves were painted pictures of gaily dressed knights and ladies. "Oh, what a lovely book!" exclaimed the boys. "Yes, it is lovely," replied the mother. "I will give it to whichever of you children can read it the best in a week." Alfred began at once to take lessons in reading, and studied hard day after day. His brothers passed their time in amusements, and made fun of Alfred's efforts. They thought he could not learn to read as well as they could, no matter how hard he should try. At the end of the week, the boys read the book to their mother, one after the other. Much to the surprise of his brothers, Alfred proved to be the best reader, and his mother gave him the book. While still very young, Alfred was sent by his father to Rome to be anointed by His Holiness the Pope. It was a long and tiresome journey, made mostly on horseback. With imposing, solemn ceremony, he was anointed by the Holy Father. Afterwards, he spent a year in Rome receiving religious instruction. 2. In the year 871, when Alfred was 22 years old, the Danes invaded various parts of England. Some great battles were fought, and Alfred's elder brother Ethelred, king of the West Saxons, was killed. Thus Alfred became king. The Danes still continued to fight the Saxons, and defeated Alfred in a long and severe struggle. They took for themselves the northern and eastern parts of England. Moreover, Danes from Denmark continued to cross the sea and ravage the coast of Saxon England. They kept the people in constant alarm. Alfred, therefore, determined to meet the pirates on their own element, the sea. So he built and equipped the first English navy, and in 875 gained the first naval victory ever won by the English. A few years after this, however, great numbers of Danes from the northern part of England came pouring into the Saxon lands. Alfred himself was obliged to flee for his life. For many months he wandered through forests and over hills to avoid being taken by the Danes. He sometimes made his home in caves and in the huts of shepherds and cowherds. Often he tended the cattle and sheep, and was glad to get a part of the farmer's dinner in pay for his services. Once, when very hungry, he went into the house of a cowherd and asked for something to eat. The cowherd's wife was baking cakes, and she said she would give him some when they were done. "Watch the cakes and do not let them burn, while I go across the field to look after the cows," said the woman as she hurried away. Alfred took his seat in the chimney corner to do as he was told, but soon his thoughts turned to his troubles, and he forgot about the cakes. When the woman came back, she cried out with vexation, for the cakes were burned and spoiled. "You lazy, good-for-nothing man," she said. "I warrant you can eat cakes fast enough, but you are too lazy to help me bake them." With that she drove the poor hungry Alfred out of her house. In his ragged dress he certainly did not look like a king, and she had no idea that he was anything but a poor beggar. 3. Some of Alfred's friends discovered where he was hiding and joined him. In a little time a body of soldiers came to him, and a strong fort was built by them. For this fort Alfred and his men went out now and then and gave battle to small parties of the Danes. Alfred was successful, and his army grew larger and larger. One day he disguised himself as a wandering minstrel and went into the camp of the Danes. He strolled here and there, playing on a harp and singing Saxon ballads. At last Guthrum, the commander of the Danes, ordered the minstrel to be brought to his tent. Alfred went. "Sing to me some of your charming songs," said Guthrum. "I never heard more beautiful music." So the kingly harper played and sang for the Dane, and went away with handsome presents. But better than that, he had gained information that was of the greatest value. In a week he attacked the Danish forces and defeated them with great slaughter in a battle which lasted all day and far into the night. Guthrum was taken prisoner and brought before Alfred. Taking his harp in his hands, Alfred played and sang one of the ballads with which he had entertained Guthrum in the camp. The Dane started in amazement and exclaimed, "You then, King Alfred, were the wandering minstrel?" "Yes," replied Alfred, "I was the musician whom you received so kindly. Your life is now in my hands, but I will give you your liberty if you will become a Christian and never again make war on my people." "King Alfred," said Guthrum, "I will become a Christian, and so will all my men, if you will grant liberty to them as to me, and henceforth we will be your friends." Alfred then released the Danes, and they were baptized as Christians. An old road running across England from London to Chester was then agreed upon as the boundary between the Danish and Saxon kingdoms, and the Danes settled in East Anglia, as the eastern part of England was called. Years of peace and prosperity followed for Alfred's kingdom. During these years the king rebuilt the towns that had been destroyed by the Danes, erected new forts, and greatly strengthened his army and navy. He also encouraged trade, and he founded a school like that established by Charlemagne. He himself translated a number of Latin books into Saxon, and probably did more for the cause of education than any other king that ever wore the English crown. End of Chapter 15. Recorded by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York. Chapter 16 of Famous Men of the Middle Ages. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Alec Datesman. Famous Men of the Middle Ages by John H. Harron and A. B. Poland. Chapter 16. Henry the Fowler, king from 919 to 936 A.D. 1. About 100 years had passed since the death of Charlemagne, and his great empire had fallen to pieces. 7 kings ruled where he had once been sole emperor. West of the Rhine, where the Germans lived, the last descendant of Charlemagne died when he was a mere boy. The German nobles were not willing for any foreign prince to govern them, and yet they saw that they must unite to defend their country against the invasions of the barbarians, called Magyars. So they met and elected Conrad, Duke of Franconia, to be their king. However, although he became king in name, Conrad never had much power over his nobles. Some of them refused to recognize him as king, and his reign was disturbed by quarrels and wars. He died in 919, and on his deathbed he said to his brother, "Henry, Duke of Saxony, is the ablest ruler in the empire. Elect him king, and Germany will have peace." A few months after Conrad's death, the nobles met at Aix-la-Chapelle and elected Henry to be their king. At this time, it was the custom in Europe to hunt various birds, such as the wild duck and partridge, with falcons. The falcons were long-winged birds of prey, resembling hawks. They were trained to perch on their master's wrist and wait patiently until they were told to fly. Then they would swiftly dart at their prey and bear it to the ground. Henry was very fond of falconry, and hence was known as Henry the Fowler, or falconer. As soon as the other dukes had elected him king, a messenger was sent to Saxony to inform him of the honor done him. After a search of some days, he was at last found, far up in the Harz mountains, hunting with his falcons. Kneeling at his feet, the messenger said, "God save you, Henry of Saxony. I come to announce the death of King Conrad, and to tell you that the nobles have elected you to succeed him as king of the Germans." For a moment the duke was speechless with amazement. Then he exclaimed, "Elected me king? I cannot believe it. I am a Saxon, and King Conrad was a Frank and bitter enemy to me." "It is true," replied the messenger. "Conrad, when dying, advised that the nobles should choose you as his successor." Henry was silent for a while, and then he said, "King Conrad was a good man. I know it now, and I am sorry that I did not understand him better when he was alive. I accept the position offered to me, and I pray that I may be guided by heaven in ruling this people." So Henry the Fowler left the chase to take up his duties as king of the Germans. 2. In proper time Henry was proclaimed king of Germany, but he was hardly seated on the throne when the country was invaded by thousands of Magyars, from the land which we know today as Hungary. As soon as possible, Henry gathered an army and marched to meet the barbarians. He came upon a small force under the command of the son of the Magyar king. The Germans easily routed the Magyars and took the king's son prisoner. This proved to be a very fortunate thing, because it stopped the war for a long term of years. When the Magyar king learned that his son was a prisoner in the hands of King Henry, he was overwhelmed with grief. He mourned for his son day and night, and at last sent to the German camp a Magyar chief with a flag of truce to beg that the prince might be given up. "Our king says that he will give whatever you demand for the release of his son," said the chief to the German monarch. "I will give up the prince on this condition only," was the reply. "The Magyars must leave the soil of Germany immediately, and promise not to war on us for 9 years. During those years I will pay to the king yearly 5,000 pieces of gold." "I accept the terms in the king's name," responded the chief. The prince was, therefore, given up, and the Magyars withdrew. During the 9 years of truce, King Henry paid great attention to the organization of an army. Before this, the German soldiers had fought chiefly on foot, not as the Magyars did, on horseback. For this reason, they were at a great disadvantage in battle. The king now raised a strong force of horsemen, and had them drilled so thoroughly that they became almost invincible. The infantry also were carefully drilled. Besides this, Henry built a number of forts in different parts of his kingdom, and had all the fortified cities made stronger. The following year the Magyar chief appeared at the German court, and demanded a 10th payment. "Not a piece of gold will be given you," replied King Henry. "Our truce is ended." In less than a week a vast body of Magyars entered Germany to renew the war. Henry held his army in waiting until lack of food compelled the barbarians to divide their forces into 2 separate bodies. One division was sent to one part of the country, the other to another part. Henry completely routed both divisions, and the power of the Magyars in Germany was broken. The Danes also invaded Henry's kingdom, but he defeated them and drove them back. Henry reigned for 18 years, and when he died, all Germany was peaceful and prosperous. His son Otto succeeded him. He assumed the title of Emperor, which Charlemagne had borne more than 100 years before. From that time on, for nearly 1,000 years, all the German emperors claimed to be the successors of Charlemagne. They called their domain the Holy Roman Empire, and took the title Emperor, or Emperor of the Romans, until the year 1806, when Francis II resigned it. End of Chapter 16. Recorded by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York. Chapter 17 of Famous Men of the Middle Ages. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Alec Datesman. Famous Men of the Middle Ages by John H. Harron and A. B. Poland. Chapter 17. Canute the Great, King from 1014 to 1035. 1. The Danes, you remember, had the eastern and northern parts of England in the time of Alfred. Alfred's successors drove them farther and farther north, and at length the Danish kingdom in England came to an end for a time. But the Danes in Denmark did not forget that there had been such a kingdom, and in the year 1013, Sweyn, king of Denmark, invaded England and defeated the Anglo-Saxons. Ethelred, their king, fled to Normandy. Sweyn now called himself the King of England, but in a short time he died, and his son Canute succeeded to his throne. Canute was 19 years old. He had been his father's companion during the war with the Anglo-Saxons, and thus had had a good deal of experience as a soldier. After the death of Sweyn, some of the Anglo-Saxons recalled King Ethelred and revolted against the Danes. Canute, however, went to Denmark, and there raised one of the largest armies of Danes that had ever been assembled. With this powerful force, he sailed to England. When he landed, Northumberland and Wessex acknowledged him as king. Shortly after this, Ethelred died. Canute now thought he would find it easy to get possession of all England. This was a mistake. Ethelred left a son named Edmund Ironside, who was a very brave soldier. He became, by his father's death, the king of Saxon England, and at once raised an army to defend his kingdom. A battle was fought, and Edmund was victorious. This was the first of 5 battles that were fought in 1 year. In none of them could the Danes do more than gain a slight advantage now and then. However, the Saxons were at last defeated in a 6th battle through the act of a traitor. Edric, a Saxon noble, took his men out of the fight, and his treachery so weakened the Saxon army that Edmund Ironside had to surrender to Canute. But the young Dane had greatly admired Edmund for the way in which he had fought against heavy odds, so he now treated him most generously. Canute took certain portions of England, and the remainder was given to Edmund Ironside. Thus, for a short time, the Anglo-Saxon people had at once a Danish and a Saxon monarch. 2. Edmund died in 1016, and after his death, Canute became sole ruler. He ruled wisely. He determined to make his Anglo-Saxon subjects forget that he was a foreign conqueror. To show his confidence in them, he sent back to Denmark the army he had brought over the sea, keeping on a part of his fleet and a small body of soldiers to act as guards at his palace. He now depended on the support of his Anglo-Saxon subjects, and he won their love. Although a king, and it is generally believed that kings like flattery, Canute is said to have rebuked his courtiers when they flattered him. On one occasion, when they were talking about his achievements, one of them said to him, "Most noble king, I believe you can do anything." Canute sternly rebuked the courtier for these words, and then said, "Come with me, gentlemen." He led them from the palace grounds to the seashore where the tide was rising, and had his chair placed at the edge of the water. "You say I can do anything," he said to the courtiers. "Very well. I who am king and the lord of the ocean now command these rising waters to go back and not dare wet my feet." But the tide was disobedient, and steadily rose and rose, until the feet of the king were in the water. Turning to his courtiers, Canute said, "Learn how feeble is the power of earthly kings. None is worthy the name of king, but he whom heaven and earth and sea obey." During Canute's reign, England had peace and prosperity, and the English people have ever held his memory dear. End of Chapter 17. Recorded by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York.